I'll start by giving you guys a little bit of background about myself. And when I was 20, I started in construction, and I did concrete framing and finish work, and did that for about 10 years, helped put me through my first years of college. That's kind of when I got into natural resources. I was looking at all the lumber that we were using to build, all the sand and gravel that we were using for concrete mixtures. And so it really got me into natural resources, and that's when I decided to go up to Utah State University into the College of Natural Resources. And this got my undergraduate in geography and a minor in GIS, and then currently wrapping up my master's degree with Doug Ramsey and Chris McGinty, who are two guys I worked with outside of in the RSGIS lab. So if you know those guys, those were my tutors, my mentors. So yeah, with that being said, I'll just jump into this. This is my thesis. So I did a 45-minute presentation, but don't worry, you guys won't be here that long. I've dwindled it down to about 20 minutes. And then at the very end of the thesis, I kind of will talk about thermal imaging, how it applies to oil, gas, and mining, and drone imagery, and wrap up with what I've done so far here. So using remotely piloted aircraft and infrared technology to detect and monitor these sage-grouse is something that hasn't been done a whole lot of. My research is more of a proof of concept study, and the species of interest, like I said, is the greater sage-grouse, or Centrocercus urophasianus, scientific name. And our first research question was, will these sage-grouse flush during our aerial survey? So I was really nervous that we fly the drone over these sage-grouse, they flush, and I never get any observations. So that was my first question. And so the second question leads up to that. So if they stay on the ground and they don't flush, can then I detect them, count them, and archive their spatial locations and their thermal responses, or their temperatures? And the third question is, if I can collect that data, can then I use temperature to distinguish the difference between these male and female sage-grouse? So our observation hypothesis, so what you're looking at here is a male sage-grouse displaying for these two females. And our hypothesis is that this male appears to be much warmer than the females. I don't think that their actual internal temperatures are different like ours. Like you and me probably have the same thermal temperatures. Our insides are 98, 99 degrees, right in there. So we're assuming that sage-grouse have the same internal temperature. However, when the male sage-grouse displays, that skin appears. So the analogy I like to use is, if I'm outside in the middle of winter and I have all my snow clothes on and I look at me with the thermal camera, I'm going to appear much cooler. But the instant I take my coat off, I'm going to appear much warmer. It's going to be much more reflective of my internal body temperature. So that's our hypothesis. So we decided to study a sage-grouse lek. And the reason why we study these sage-grouse leks, and just to give you a background in case you guys aren't familiar with sage-grouse, lek is basically a geographic area where year upon year these males and females will go to the same area in order to procreate and for the purpose of mating. So we knew when we were flying the drone over, we had a geographic location we expected these sage-grouse to be there. The second reason why we decided to do sage-grouse leks is because our batteries are pretty limited on our drones, and so we only had a certain amount of time to get out to make our observations. So we needed to be sure that these wildlife specimens would be where our drone is flying over. So another thing that we've got is spatial distributions of these sage-grouse. So the alpha males we know tend to occupy the center of these leks. The betas will be around competing for those spots in the center with the alpha males, and then the females will kind of be around the perimeter of that lek. So we had an idea of the spatial distributions. So the energy that we're looking at is the long wave infrared energy. So if you guys see this is electromagnetic spectrum, and this electromagnetic spectrum, the analogy I like to use is, if this electromagnetic spectrum was a dollar bill, I could pull out one of my hairs, put it on that dollar bill, and that's all you're going to see for this rainbow section. So that's all we can see with our eyes, is that little rainbow section, teeny little sliver. So if you look at that infrared, it's much larger than what we typically see with our eyes. So I wanted to leverage some of that infrared energy and see if we could detect some of these wildlife. So here's a good example of why we use thermal imaging for wildlife. The wildlife camouflage extremely well into their surrounding. So I have a question for you guys. Can anyone tell me how many ducks are in this image? I do have a gift for anyone who's willing to guess, or a prize. 4. Who said 2?
I won't take it.
All right, so I will flip back and forth and give you the idea. So there they are. So if you flip back and forth, you could start to see those little 2 ducks, and then 1 duck kind of peeking his head over the top. You can also see my footprints, which is something I thought was pretty neat. So the RPA that we used, or the remotely piloted aircraft that we had used, was the DJI S1000. And the reason why we use this is it's a heavy copter, so it can take heavy payloads on there. And I had a custom payload that I had to pre-build. So 2 years ago, they didn't have thermal cameras to just mount onto drones. So I basically took this FLIR A65 SC camera. It's a manufacturer camera that really looks at computer chips on a manufacturing line. And so I was like, cool, I can put this to the bottom of a drone. So I got it, put it to the bottom of a drone, realized I don't have any power to this thing. So I used this Goal Zero to get my power supply. But then I realized this doesn't have any recording storage on it. So then I had to put a mini PC on board this drone as well. So this mini PC is really just a DVR that records the thermal data that is seen by that sensor. And then here's the 3D custom payload box that I used, put together with Blender. It's a 3D modeling software. And it was something that took me about a day to put together. And then I worked with the Industrial Technology Center up at the Utah State University. They have a 3D printer, and they came out with this 3D printed box. So I put it on top of the scale. It weighs in at about 5.5 pounds with all the cameras, computers, and batteries that it took to record that data. So a 5-pound payload box, or my low-flying satellite, like I like to refer to it, is this right here. So all put together. This is our data collection tool. So once we had our data collection tool, we need to decide where we're going to go. So my study site's in Cache Valley in northern Utah. It's at Hardware Ranch. And looking at that graphic there in the middle, there's red polygons and yellow polygons. So those are designated no-fly zones. So you're not allowed to fly in those red polygons, and there's helicopter pads in those yellow zones. So you have to fly with strong caution in those areas. So if you look at my Hardware Ranch, it's just east of my hometown. I grew up in Hiram, so that's where I spent a lot of my childhood. So it's basically in my backyards and my stomping grounds. So I've felt pretty privileged to be able to go and do some studies in a place that I know and love. So in our flight planning, what this graphic is just simulating a drone looking at the camera. So the camera that I used is that FLIR A65 SC, has a pixel resolution of 640 by 512. And so knowing that our 25-degree lens, or our horizontal field of view, is 25 degrees, and knowing that we're 50 meters with our height above ground level, we can then use a basic geometric formula to calculate our swaths. And so our swath is 22 meters, and that's basically from this edge to this edge. So there's the 22 meters. And basically, in order to calculate our pixel resolution, all we did is divided that 22 meters by the 640 pixels in our sensor array, and that gave us roughly 3.46 centimeters for a pixel resolution. So once we knew what we were flying at 50 meters, we basically put it in an Excel chart, decided how high we were going to fly, 10 meters to 100 meters. 100 meters gave us a 45, roughly, horizontal field of view, and 7 centimeters for a pixel resolution. For our study, we flew it at 40 meters at first, and then we flew it at 50 meters. And I'll explain a little bit about that to you guys in some upcoming slides. So our flight planning. So once we knew how high we were going to fly, we needed to develop a little grid pattern that we were going to fly in. So that way we could have roughly 50 to 60% overlap, reducing our possibilities of making duplicate counts of the same sage-grouse. So if we saw the sage-grouse in this pass, and you got to take in mind that this is only 3 to 4 seconds that I have in each pass over those sage-grouse, and then I turn and I come back, I want to make sure I have enough overlap to say this is the same sage-grouse that I saw in pass 1 as I saw in pass number 2. So flying in that grid pattern helped me reduce those counts, those duplicated counts. So the grid pattern is those orange points. So let me go back to it. Yeah, and you guys feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions. You don't need to wait to the end. So that grid pattern is those purple points. So the GPS receiver for these drones typically will gather a point every 2 seconds, 1 second if you're got it going fast. So each one of those points are being populated every second when that drone flies. And so that's where we get those point features. That orange layer is basically our swath. So that's saying how far my camera is going to be able to see. So that orange area, that polygon, is all the area that we had studied. So once we put all of our image collection tools together, here's our methodology. Here's some feed from our drone. It's kind of hard to pick out, but inside that red polygon, there's roughly 20 Sage-Grouse. And if you look at that graph in the upper right, the pixel versus temperature plot is what you're looking at. Those 3 spikes are those displaying males. So those displaying males, actually, we can see those throat sacs coming out. And like I kind of pointed out, our hypothesis was they appear much warmer than the non-displaying in the females. So displaying males identification and characterization was pretty easy for us, much like they do on the ground. If you see the Sage-Grouse chest go in and out, we say that's a male. One of the cool things about this is that we have 2 independent observations of the same Sage-Grouse, but they yield roughly the same exact thermal responses. So that's something that could be used for automating some of these population counts. So you don't have to go around and just say, I see one here, I'm going to make a point. We could maybe use some of these rasters and automate those temperatures values and say, this is potential male. It needs an editor or a person to go and make a visual assessment and then make sure that is the observation that we found. So the female and non-displaying males, so just to give you the idea, like I said, we fly over these Sage-Grouse pretty quick, so if I didn't see them actually display, then I couldn't call them a displaying male. So is what I use is the physiological features. So I extracted those with a region of interest. And so using these lines, I was able to say from pixel 1 on their beak to pixel N at their tail. So I could determine the length of these Sage-Grouse. And then I used the polygon area, so I got the area of that Sage-Grouse and determined how big these Sage-Grouse were. And then I used the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service 2010 report on their proportions to classify these based on their size. And so the males from their report is roughly 66 to 76 centimeters long, and the females were roughly 48 to 58 centimeters. And then the females, like I showed you in that first video, are roughly 2/3 the size of those male Sage-Grouse. So once we used the area and the length to classify male versus female, I needed to determine if there is statistical significance in their temperature values. So I was going to use the student's t-test, which is one of the most traditional t-tests that you could use. However, I didn't have the same exact number of males and females showing up. So I had to do the Welch's t-test, which is an adaptation of the student's t-test. It's more reliable when you have 2 unequal sample sizes and unequal variances. And just to kind of point that out, so this red line is what you're looking at is those displaying males. And it has this peak right here, a high average temperature of around 27 degrees Celsius. And then it has this wide variance from edge to edge. And you can see that these females and non-displaying males have a much more narrow variance, and their means are much lower temperatures. And so that's why I decided to use that Welch's t-test. And we are assuming that the 2 samples have the same means or have the same temperatures. And so that's what this is testing against. So that's how we did our methodology, get into some of these results. So before each one of our flights, I would conduct a ground count before we launched the drone. Then once we launched the drone, we would conduct our aerial census. So what you're seeing in this graph is the green line is the ground count, orange line is the aerial count, what we saw from the air. On our very first flight, So like I said, I would explain this. So we saw roughly 13 sage-grouse from the ground. We flew the drone up over, made it over the top of them, and then it started a banking maneuver is what we call it. So the throttles started to adjust on the motors, and they flushed. And I was like, no, I almost fell on the ground crying. I was like, my thesis is ruined. And Doug's like, oh, well, you can write about what doesn't work. So I was like, oh no, that's not what I want to do. And so I was pretty disappointed, but then I got back to the lab and found that there was 5 sage-grouse that had stayed on the Lek. So I was very excited about that. And a sage-grouse friend told me those were probably those alpha males that were more determined to stay on the Lek than some of those other females and beta males. So, but as you can see, our trend went upwards. The population started to see its peak at the Lek around March 26th, and we had a large difference between our aerial count and my ground count, and that was mostly because some of these sage-grouse were on the perimeter of the Lek, so they were obstructed by sagebrush. So while I was on the ground looking at a horizontal view, I had a hard time counting those ones, and I wasn't able to. But with the bird's eye view with the drone, we were able to detect those and monitor those and archive those sage-grouse. Yeah.
Is this a period of time that they're normally in that Lek, or
Yep. So.
are they dawn at certain times? And
Yep. So lekking will typically occur between like early March to the end of April. And so that's kind of why we knew the sage-grouse were going to be in this location in between these months. So that's why we decided to go out there. And the very last flight was the official Department of Wildlife Resources count for sage-grouse. And so our count is right next to the official count that's been archived. So that gave us a lot of confidence in our data results. So those thermal characterizations, so like I said, I was able to use the polygon to get the area, but those polygons also extracted the maximum temperature of the sage-grouse, which was 1 pixel typically found on the forefront of the sage-grouse, towards the beak or towards the eyes or the nose. For the displaying males, it was on the chest. And we were also to get the minimum temperature, which was typically found on the tails of those sage-grouse, and we got the mean temperature. The mean temperature is the culmination of all of those pixels inside of that area of that polygon. And so we also used the lines to get those length, but it also gave us these thermal profiles, and that's what you're seeing on this graph to the right. So on that x-axis, so what you're seeing is the length of the sage-grouse, 1 to 13. And so we had one sage-grouse that was 13 pixels long, a bunch of them at 12 pixels. The females typically were between 8 to 11 pixels long. And as you see here, those red lines, or those displaying males, were much warmer at 27 degrees Celsius, and the females were right around 14 to 15 degrees Celsius. So in my thesis, we were able to digitally archive these spatial locations and give these thermal characterizations and sex classifications to these sage-grouse using the area and length, but using that t-test. I needed to determine if they were statistically significant. So just to give you guys an idea, I took out the displaying males. I tested them using R, and they were statistically significant. However, it was just an ugly table, so I decided just to show you guys these non-displaying males in comparison to females. So in parameter 1, those are non-displaying males' maximum temperatures being compared against the female maximum temperatures, that single pixel on the forefront of their body. Then we looked at their range, and the range is basically just the minimum subtracted from the maximum pixel, and that gave us the range of values, and then the mean and the minimum temperature. So the t statistic is what you're looking at. The number, when it gets closer to 0, they're more the same. So if it was 0, there would be no statistical significance. They would be the same. They wouldn't be different. So the larger the number, the more separation there is, which I found interesting for the range, because the range, if you look at those x1, x2 values, those means are only 1.9 degrees different, but the maximum has almost a 3-degree difference, 2.5 degrees difference. However, the t statistic for the range is different because there's more of a difference between 1.9 than there is between the 2.5 and the maximum temperature. So as you can see, all those p-values, they were all statistically significant, which I found to be kind of crazy for the minimum temperature. I was like, there's no way minimum temperature could be used to help classify these sage-grouse. But according to this t-test, you could use it. However, it's less statistically significant than using that range or the maximum temperature. Those would be the two that I would classify sex based off of. So in our discussions, to the best of my knowledge, there's not been anyone else who's been able to use thermal imagery to identify the difference between male and female sage-grouse. There's been a couple that have tried. Hansen et al. Used a fixed-wing drone, and they were able to detect those, but they weren't able to determine the difference between their sex. And then Gillette et al. Used a fixed-wing manned aircraft, and they flew down to roughly 500 meters, and they were able to detect them, but they weren't able to determine the difference between the males and the females. So more research needs to be conducted to examine the differences between these displaying males and the yearlings. So the yearlings and the females, maybe there's some really big females out there and some really small yearling males out there. And so I would like to do some GPS collaring work to help get some ground truth data. I think that would be beneficial for future studies. Conducting auditory and flight path studies. So how does the sound of these drones affect these wildlife? Because it would affect different wildlife in different ways. Sage-grouse don't hear that well in comparison to something like a deer or an elk or a rabbit. And so we need to determine if we need to go higher and how that impacts those wildlife. And also looking at the flight path studies. Like I showed you guys, I went in that grid pattern, but there are a lot of drones come in these orbital patterns, so they'll go fly in a circle, but I'm not quite sure if that will be reflective of predators. So I'm not quite sure how the sage-grouse would react to a predator type of orbit. So that would be something else that would be interesting. So more could be done to examine the difference between traditional surveys and drone surveys for these sage-grouse, especially where a lot of these drones are getting smaller, quieter. They're more affordable cameras that are being put on those, so you can fly higher and get better resolution. So it's a lot like cell phones 2 years ago. Like I said, there's no thermal cameras for drones, but now there's a lot of those, and man, I would have killed to have one of those drones with the thermal camera already put together. That was a lot of my work. Yeah, Susan.
Wondering on the 4 different flights that you tested,
Mm-hmm.
if there was any difference in the ambient temperature? If the ambient temperature was lower, did you have better analysis of whether male, female?
Right, you should be on my committee. My committee members asked me the same questions. So yeah, ambient temperature did have an effect. The warmer the air temperature, the warmer the readings were from the sage-grouse. The cooler the air temperature, the cooler the readings were. Luckily on my flights, they were all pretty close to the same 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So it wasn't a whole lot of difference. But however, with thermal energy, when you're looking at it from higher above, and the air temperature is, say it's a certain temperature, it's going to have a hard time transmitting through all those air particles. So the farther up I am, the cooler it got on the ground. And the closer I am, the warmer it got. And so there's definitely a trade-off between those temperature values and the ambient air temperature. And so for me, like I said, I just averaged those together, and that's how I was trying to mitigate that. The FLIR software also takes environmental variables into consideration for you. And so I basically say, here's the relative humidity, here's the air temperature, and distance to ground. And it helped normalize those temperatures to make the sage-grouse the same temperature, even though the air temperature and relative humidity was a big factor. Relative humidity, because the more water particles that are in the air, the more energy it takes to transmit, and so it's gonna be cooler transmitting through that relative humidity. So relative humidity almost seemed to be more of a factor than air temperature. So that would be something that would be taken into consideration in the software though, and adjusted for. So just to kind of show you guys some happenstance data, that's a bunny right there. Like I said, some of animals hear better than others. So that one was fast. He's like, that drone comes over the top of me, and man, I'm out of here, Here's his buddy, not quite so fast. He's like, I can take this, watch this. And then we get right over the top of him, and he's like, I don't think I could take this, I'm out of here too. And so Those are a couple of bunnies that were on there. Just to show you, the smallest we were able to pick up was a vole. I got about 4 pixels on this vole, and he runs right up that little vole track, runs underneath some dirt, and pokes his head up to look up at the drone and say, "What is that?" So it is pretty interesting. We were able to get very small critters. This is flying at 50 meters above the ground level, or 150 feet roughly. So that's all cool. Wildlife is great, but I'm here in oil, gas, and mining. So I've been looking at some of these thermal cameras that they're called optical gas imaging. And so this is looking at natural gas leaks or methane. And so these natural gas leaks can actually be detected with some of these thermal cameras. Now, the thermal camera I had can't detect these gas leaks. You have to get a specialized thermal camera. But there's a lot of really cool technology that FLIR is putting out there. So they're also able to see CO2. This is a CO2 coming off of these stacks. So it's pretty cool technology that would be used in some gas detection. Some drone applications. So here's just a little photogrammetry 3D model put together by Drone to GIS company. I just kind of wanted to show you guys some of the examples of other people using it for mining applications. So in this 3D model, they were looking at brake lines, and they actually were able to find some of these bank failures on these brake lines. And I thought that was something that was pretty interesting. They fly up and they get tons of points. In one flight, something that take us a couple of weeks to go out there and get all those points. Another interesting thing is looking at these stockyards. In a 2D map, we could only use these to get area, but now using these 3D models, we're actually able to calculate volume. So you can get these volume measurements and get total on-site stock measurements. And more than that, you can not just look at these stocks, you can also estimate some of these loose and raw materials. And you could determine how much you still have to go out there and mine or extract. And you can also calculate some fills. And so the one thing I liked about this software is you're able to fill it out, and it modifies the terrain in that raster for you or in that 3D model. So I thought that was some pretty interesting stuff that could be done with these drones and 3D modeling. So that was pretty good for the surface mines, but 3D modeling goes below the surface. And looking at some of what the DNR's already put together, I found this model that Jay Hill from the UGS has already put together. I thought this is something that'd be applicable to oil and gas. So on that top layer is what you're looking at is something like a DEM would put out, or those photogrammetry 3D models would be put out. But below that, you can actually see these granite subsurfaces. So he was able to actually calculate where that was, and he was able to do that the same with the heat volume map. So I thought that was something that was very interesting. He also put in the fault lines, and so the fault lines, you can insert those. You can put in your existing well structures, where they're going, and you can also put in proposed well structures. And so that was something I thought was pretty neat that's already been used in some other people's work in the DNR, and I thought it was something that would be nice to show you guys that could be applied to us down here in Dahlgren. So I've only been here a month, but what have I done? I haven't just put this presentation together. I've done a little more than that. So I've worked with this GIS project and return on investment report. Wade Clues has put these together. If you guys, anyone does GIS, then if you haven't seen one of these, I'm sure you will. And I worked with Jan Morse from AMR, and we put together, she had a little GIS nuisance basically that she needed to help clean up. And so she'd get 80 maps from this company, and this company would say, here's all the maps, but she would open up the maps and they had all these broken data sources. And so after I looked at it, it was 80 maps and roughly 10 data sources per map. So there's 800 features she had to repair, and this would take roughly 2 days. So that's the 16 hours up there, and she'd get it roughly 5 times a year. So that's the 5 up there. And so, and using Wade's template, I basically am able to say that there is 28,000 or 2,800 a year is what it cost us to do that. And by just simply changing the map properties and storing relative path names, she no longer has to do any of that work. So that came up with zeros for our hours to complete this enhanced workflow. And so that was basically a half an hour of discussion, and that half an hour of discussion back and forth gave us a future annual savings of that $2,800 or 16,000% for your future annual return on investment, which is something that I thought was crazy. I'm like, 16,000%, there's wrong. What did Wade give me? Turned out he's right. So, so it's pretty impressive. So if you guys have any like small, even just streamlining some of these GIS processes, I'm happy to help with some of this. It's something that me and Jen worked through relatively quickly. I know that all of them aren't going to be this reflective, like 16,000% of savings on your return on investment. But I do think that I could definitely help with some of the monotonous GIS tasks that sometimes discourage people from using GIS and help streamline that so it's not such a hindrance.
You kind of did that to yourself. You started off with 16,000%. What are you going to do to top that?
Yeah, right? Right, I'm in trouble now. All right, well, cool. So that's pretty much my presentation. Do I have any additional questions? Yeah.
Going back to your Sage-Grouse assessment, there was a disparity between your numbers, your ground surveys and your aerial surveys when you first started, because you said they kind of flew away.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, the other observations were much closer, or maybe I was curious if you changed your flight path of the drone to enter the area, or did you do something different?
Yes, I'm sorry, I meant to point that out. So we went from 40 meters on that first flight to 50 meters. So second meter from then on was at 50 meters above the ground. And I'm not quite positive if the height was the reason that they stayed. We just went that high because I was afraid of going at 40 and having them flush every time. But at 50 meters, they didn't flush. But someone told me that it could have been their determination. They could be more eager to stay when it gets closer to peak Leks attendance. Yeah, or they got to know the drone. Exactly, could be acclimation. They're like, oh, hey, I know that guy. He didn't kill me last time. It's not an ego. Let's just fly. And so that was kind of the reason why I think that they didn't flush on those last 4 flights. With the first flight they did, what may have been due to our height above ground. And so we did adjust the height above ground level, and we went up to 50 meters and had better results when we did that. So I had you and
I wonder if that's around the height that predator hawks come in at.
yes, and so hawks will and eagles. We actually did have an eagle approach us on our second flight, and it came and checked out the drone. And the Sage-Grouse, I was like, oh man, they're gonna fly because of the eagle. And the eagle took off, didn't attack the drone. So I don't quite know why that why they didn't flush. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what their optimal altitude is. I do know they tend to come low along the horizon, those predators, and then they'll come up and then dive bomb. So it's more of how you come from the horizon is what I found, not necessarily your height. There's a study that was done on ducks, flamingos, and a couple other waterfowl, and they basically determined the different angles to come as they're approaching these different wildlife species, and they found that coming down on this 90 degrees was the worst, and coming across the top of them was probably the best way to do it. So if you're going to, so when we start, we'd go up to our first waypoint, because the drone was basically on autopilot, so we gave it a series of waypoints. So we'd make sure it got to its maximum altitude before we started to go over the Sage-Grouse, because we were afraid if we came up off of the horizon, then they were going to be acting like it was a predator. And so that we definitely had to take some of those instances into account. Susan?
So I believe that GWR or biologists have a ratio, male-female ratio, that they estimate total population size from maybe 1 in 4, 1 male to every 4 females. I was just wondering if your counts reflected your estimates of how many females and how many males kind of tracked along that.
Yeah.
ratio.
Yeah, so they did kind of reflect that. I think it's something like 70 to 80% will be males, and 20 to 30% will be those females. And an also interesting fact.
Have more males than females.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, did I say that backwards? Yeah. So there's definitely, is what I guess I meant to say is, so 90% of the females will mate with 10% of those males, but there's more males on the lek, obviously, than the females. So yeah, there's definitely, the vital rates were important, and it would be cool to look at some of those, but we didn't get any action on camera. So we weren't able to see any of those vital rates. But I thought it was reflective of what was found in the studies.
So what, you were saying that just the technology is coming along a lot faster or more rapidly now to have instrumentation that's light enough to adapt to a drone. What do you see happening in a little while, and what are costs? What are you looking at costs and things like that?
So for costs, basically our S1000 costed us roughly $6,000, and now you can buy it for $1,500. So a lot like cell phones, they drop dramatically in price over a couple of years. And the cameras are getting smaller and lighter, so you're able to go farther distances and collect more data. And so I think we're pretty close to what technology has to offer. I think the technology is way further along than the policy. Policy tends to be more of the things that restrict us. The laws haven't kept up with the technology. And so I would think that would be more of the bottleneck than the technology. I think it's just going to continue a lot like cell phones. Every year, every 2 years, there's a new model of a new drone coming out, new camera. DJI and FLIR are constantly, every year to every 2 years, are trying to put out a new product for these types of applications.
Do you see the division purchasing some equipment?
I do know that some divisions have already got these within the DNR. I think that's something that's up to John Baza, but I'm hoping that we can maybe get some. Get one of those if we can find the right reasons we need to use it, the right applications. And then that will also decide what type we get, whether it's a multi-rotor or a fixed wing, because these drones and their data collection's heavily driven by their application.
DEQ has one of those FLIR cameras, and they're about $100,000. Have they gotten cheaper?
Yeah, well, some of them have. So there's some that are still up at 100, 200. That one I talked about on that fixed wing manned was like $500,000 camera that comes with the gimbal and all the gyroscope and all the stuff that went with it. The camera that I showed, the A65, is $8,000. The new ones that they have for the drones range anywhere between $2,500 to $10,000. So, I mean, in the scheme of things, these cameras are much more affordable than they used to be, especially when you're considering a $100,000 camera like the DEQ probably has. But also, with that, you may have some sacrifices in the data quality. I'm not sure what camera they have, but if you pay $2,000 for this FLIR View Pro, it basically gives you a really coarse pixel resolution. It's like 336 by 180, really awful pixel resolution. The high def is now 640 by 512. And they're starting to come out with 1080p like we're all used to seeing, but those are still around the $100,000 to $200,000 price range. So what you saw on here was a 640 by 512, and to me that was sufficient for this application. So they're definitely getting them much more affordable. Any other questions? Cool, sounds good.
Well, thanks, Tom. We appreciate you sharing
Yeah.
with us. Thanks.